The rain came down hard over lower Manhattan, the kind that turned streetlights into smeared orange blurs and drove everyone sensible indoors. It was 2:14 in the morning, and the alley between a shuttered bodega and a parking structure on Vesey Street was completely empty, which was the only reason nobody died when the sky cracked open. There was no dramatic build-up, no rumble of distant thunder, no gathering light. One moment, the alley was dark and wet and ordinary. The next, a column of fracturing energy detonated from a point 6 feet above the asphalt, spinning colors that had no business existing in a New York night sky. Deep violet, hard white, something gold that left burns on the retina. And then it was gone. Gone like a door slamming. Gone like a held breath cut short. As what remained was a man on one knee in a crater of cracked concrete, steam rising off the ground around him, rain hissing where it struck armor that was still hot from whatever transit had just gone catastrophically wrong. Thor Odinson stayed on one knee for 3 full seconds. His head was down. Rain hammered the back of his red cape, pooled in the grooves of his silver pauldrons, ran in cold rivers down the bridge of his nose. Mjolnir was in his right fist, head pressed against the broken concrete like a walking staff, and his knuckles were white around the leather strap. He was breathing, deliberately, evenly, the way a man breathes when he is deciding whether the ground beneath him is safe before he trusts his weight to it. He looked up. The alley opened onto a wide street. He could see yellow cabs, dark at this hour, a hunt parked along a curb. He could see glass towers, dozens of them, climbing into a low ceiling of cloud that glowed orange from the city below. He could see a food cart, plastic sheeting lashed over it against the rain. He could see signage in English. He could see a subway grate bleeding warm steam into the cold air. He could see everything that looked, at first glance, like New York. And he had been to New York. He had stood on these streets before, had bled on streets very much like them, had watched Stark's tower blink from somewhere north of here. None of this felt right. He could not have explained it immediately. The geometry was correct, the language was correct, the smell of wet concrete and exhaust and cheap cooking oil was exactly what he remembered. But there was something in the quality of the air itself, something in the way the city sounded at this hour. Slightly wrong frequency, slightly wrong rhythm. That told him, on a level older than thought, that he was not where he was supposed to be. The Bifrost had never done this. The Bifrost was Heimdall's instrument, precise as a surgeon's blade. What had just happened was not precision. What had just happened was a fracture. He rose to his full height, rolled his shoulders, and reached out. Heimdall. Nothing. Not silence exactly. There was always ambient noise in the Bifrost frequencies if you knew how to listen. But nothing that responded. No golden awareness at the other end of the connection. He tried again, pushing harder, the way you shout into a corridor you think might be longer than it looks. Still nothing. He stood in the rain and felt, for the first time in a very long while, the specific cold weight of being genuinely unreachable. He stepped out of the alley. A police cruiser turned the corner 30 meters away, headlights sweeping across the wet street, and the driver hit the brakes before his brain had fully processed what he was seeing. A man. Enormous. Standing in the open in full armor, silver and black, a scarlet cape matted wet against his back, holding a hammer the size of a human head, looking up at the skyline with an expression of focused calm that was somehow more alarming than aggression would have been. The officer in the passenger seat had his window down before the car had fully stopped. His hand was on his weapon. "Sir, hey, sir, I need you to put that down." Thor looked at him, looked at the weapon, looked back at the officer's face, and he had enough experience with Midgardian law enforcement to understand the general shape of what was being asked, and under different circumstances he might have obliged, set Mjolnir down, shown his hands, given the man the courtesy of a calm conversation. But the hammer didn't go down for police officers any more than the sun went down on request, and more importantly, he needed information, not a surrender posture. "I have no quarrel with you," Thor said. His voice in a quiet street at 2 a.m. was considerable. "I need to know what city this is." The officer stared at him. "This is... what? The city? What city?" "New York. This is New York City, sir, and I need you to step back and put down." "Which New York?" Thor said, mostly to himself. And the officer heard it and didn't know what to do with it, because it was when the second cruiser arrived, and then the third, and the radio chatter began. Thor stood in the crosshatch of headlights and let them shout at him for a moment while he looked up at the sky, jaw set, calculating. The clouds above Manhattan were low and flat, and held no trace of Asgardian light. Wherever the Bifrost had deposited him, it was not a place Heimdall was watching. It was not a place Heimdall could find. He needed altitude. He needed to scan the sky from above the cloud layer and attempt to sense any residual Bifrost energy. Any thread, however thin, that might still connect this universe to his own. He looked back at the officers, who had now grown to 6 and were all screaming different things simultaneously. "Move back," he said, not unkindly. He raised Mjolnir and the officers scattered, and he was in the air before the first one hit the ground on their stomach. The wind from his departure rocked 2 cruisers on their frames. He broke through the cloud ceiling in under 4 seconds and came out above a solid gray floor stretching to every horizon, the city's orange glow bleeding up through it from below, the sky above clean and black and full of stars that were exactly where they should be and told him nothing useful at all. He hovered there, rain above the clouds becoming nothing, the air thin and cold against his face, and he turned slowly in a full circle, extending every sense he had. He was old enough and had traveled the Bifrost enough times to know what its residue felt like. A faint harmonic, a lightness in the quantum texture of local space. He felt nothing, not fading, not blocked, nothing, as if the transit point had already sealed itself completely, as if whatever had fractured during his crossing had closed like a wound before he could get back through it. Below him, the city hummed and glittered and knew nothing about what had just arrived in its airspace. Somewhere in a glass tower that dominated the midtown skyline, a camera feed that had been triggered by the police radio traffic flickered to life on a monitoring screen. A security operative leaned forward in her chair, coffee forgotten, and stared at the figure hovering above the cloud layer on a thermal feed. Broad-shouldered, stationary, an energy signature that didn't match anything in the database, and reached for her phone. Thor stayed above the clouds and tried Heimdall one more time, and the silence that answered him was absolute. The footage hit the internet at 2:31 a.m. A woman named Destiny Okafor, 23 years old, nursing a shift work coffee on the 4th floor of her apartment building, had her phone pressed against the glass of her living room window when the alley across the street lit up like a welding torch. She got 11 seconds of usable video before her hands started shaking too badly to hold the frame. 11 seconds of violet and gold light, of cracked concrete, of a figure rising from a crater in full armor with a hammer in his fist, and she uploaded it to her socials before she had even consciously decided to, the way people do when their nervous system moves faster than their judgment. By 2:47 a.m., it had 400,000 views. By 3:10 a.m., it had crossed 3 million, and in the comment sections were a screaming war between people who recognized the armor and people who said those people were insane, and a third category who simply typed variations of what the fuck over and over in the hope that repetition would make the situation more comprehensible. By 3:15 a.m., Vought International's overnight monitoring team had flagged it, cross-referenced it against their proprietary soup database, returned 0 matches, and escalated to the duty supervisor. By 3:22 a.m., the duty supervisor had escalated to Ashley Barrett. Ashley Barrett had been asleep for 40 minutes when her phone went off. She sat up in the dark of her apartment, looked at the notification, looked at the footage, and felt the specific quality of dread that had become her most constant companion since taking this job. The dread that arrived whenever something happened that had no slot in any existing Vought protocol document. An unregistered soup was manageable. An unregistered soup with no compound feed trace in any blood sample database, no known alias, no social media presence, no country of origin, no corporate affiliation, and an energy signature that made the V monitoring equipment read an error code. That was not manageable. That was a category unknown, and category unknown events required her to call Homelander. She hated calling Homelander. She called Homelander. He picked up on the second ring, which meant he hadn't been sleeping, which was its own kind of unsettling. As she sent him the footage without preamble and listened to the sound of his breathing on the other end while he watched it. 12 seconds of silence. Then, where is he now? Above the cloud layer over lower Manhattan. We have thermal on him. He hasn't moved in 6 minutes. Another pause. He's just floating there. Yes. Above the clouds. Yes, Homelander. The sound he made was thoughtful, almost amused, and that was somehow worse than anger would have been. He's big. Our analysts are running everything we have. There's no compound V signature at all, not even a suppressed one. Whatever he is, he didn't come from a lab. The hammer is emitting some kind of "I'll handle it." We should probably establish a communications protocol before anyone makes contact. There are legal considerations around unaffiliated. Ashley. His voice dropped half a register in the way it did when he was done pretending to have a conversation. I said I'll handle it. The line went dead. Ashley sat in the dark of her apartment and pulled up the thermal feed on her tablet and watched the broad-shouldered heat signature hovering motionless above the Manhattan cloud deck and felt the particular exhaustion of a woman who could see exactly how the next several hours were going to go and had absolutely no power to change any of it. In a different building, 11 blocks south, the situation room of the Sevens Vought Tower residential floor was already lit. Black Noir stood at the window in his suit, helmet on, which meant nothing because Black Noir was always in his suit and helmet. The Deep was on the couch in a bathrobe eating cereal and watching the social media feed scroll on the main screen, occasionally making small comments to no one in particular. Starlight, Annie January, was standing near the door in street clothes, arms crossed, watching the thermal feed with the expression of someone who had learned to read the temperature of a situation before committing to a response. She had been awake when the call came in. She was almost always awake. "Nobody knows anything about this guy," the Deep said, nodding at the thermal image. "Like nothing. Zero. I had my people check the whole—" "You don't have people," Starlight said. "I have contacts, aquatic contacts." He spooned cereal into his mouth. "Point is, nothing. No name, no team, no country. That energy reading is insane. Where does a signature like that even come from?" "Could be alien," Starlight said, and she said it quietly, thinking out loud rather than making a declaration, because in a world where Compound 5 could produce a man who could level a city block, the distance between human and alien had always felt more porous than the public understood. "The suit looks like armor," the Deep said. "Old armor, like medieval." "Homelander's going up," Starlight said, reading something off her phone. Her jaw tightened slightly. "He's going alone." The Deep lowered his spoon. Even he understood what that meant. Homelander went alone when he wanted to establish something, and what he wanted to establish was almost never anything good. Queen Maeve came through the door behind Starlight at that moment, dressed and alert. And she read the room in 2 seconds the way she always did. The feed, the thermal image, the tightness around Starlight's eyes, and crossed directly to the window and stood there looking out at the low orange cloud ceiling over the southern end of the island. "Anyone told the boys?" Maeve asked. "Which boys?" the Deep said. "Butcher." Silence. Then the Deep, carefully. "Why would we tell Butcher?" Maeve said nothing. She kept looking at the clouds. There was something in the shape of that thermal signature that she couldn't articulate yet. Something about the stillness of it, the patience of it, the way it just hovered there without apparent concern for anything happening below. That put a very old and very quiet feeling in her chest. She'd been doing this long enough to know the difference between someone performing confidence and someone who simply had no reason to be afraid. The figure above the clouds had not moved in 11 minutes. It was not scanning for exits. It was not posturing for cameras. It appeared, at least from a thermal satellite image, to be thinking. She had never seen Homelander think before acting. 40 blocks north, in the kind of building where the elevator smelled like cigarettes and someone's bad decisions, Billy Butcher was awake. He was always awake at this hour, sitting at the table in the kitchen with a mug of tea gone cold and his laptop open, and he had been watching the Destiny Okafor video on a 3-second loop for the past 8 minutes. Not the figure, the impact crater. He had zoomed in on the cracked concrete, on the radius of the blast, on the depth of the depression left by whatever had landed there, and he was doing the quiet, brutal arithmetic of a man who had spent years calculating exactly how much force it took to hurt things that were not supposed to be hurtable. He reached over and pulled a yellow legal pad toward him and wrote one word on it. He underlined it twice. Then he picked up his phone and called Frenchie. Thor heard him coming before he saw him. Not footsteps. There were no footsteps at this altitude. What he heard was the specific displacement of air that a body moving at high velocity produces when it has no craft around it, no engine, no mechanism. just mass punching through atmosphere on its own power. Thor had heard that sound before. He had made that sound before. He turned in the air, cape lifting in the wind above the cloud deck, and watched the figure rise through the orange-lit cloud ceiling below him and level off about 40 meters away, hovering with arms loosely at his sides, and looked at him. The man was wearing a suit, blue and white, a stylized letter across the chest, a cape. Thor noted the cape. It noted the deliberate parallel with some mild interest. And his face was open and clean-featured and wearing an expression that was almost welcoming. Almost. The eyes were doing something different from the mouth. The eyes were the eyes of a man who had already decided how this conversation ended and was simply waiting for the other party to finish talking. Thor knew that look. He'd worn it himself in darker years. "Hell of a night for a flight," the man said. His voice carried easily across the gap between them, pitched just loud enough to be heard, just friendly enough to feel like a trap. "You new in town?" Thor studied him for a moment. "I'm passing through," he said. "Or I was. I find myself temporarily delayed." Temporarily. The man smiled. It was a good smile, technically flawless. "That's an interesting word. Well, you've been floating up here for almost 15 minutes. That's not really passing through. That's more like settling in. I'm attempting to re-establish contact with my people," Thor said, which was true, and which he said with a straightforward directness he applied to most things, because he was not by nature a dissembler. "I do not intend to remain in this city. I have no interest in whatever concerns you are carrying. If you would tell me who governs this realm and how I might contact them, I will be on my way as soon as I am able and cause no further disruption." The man tilted his head very slightly. "Who governs this realm?" he repeated, tasting the phrasing. That's a fun way to put it. He drifted forward a few meters, not quickly, not aggressively, just closing the conversational distance in the way powerful people do when they want to remind you that distance is a thing they can remove whenever they choose. "I'm Homelander. Maybe you've heard of me." Thor had not heard of him. He said so. Something moved behind Homelander's eyes. It was fast and it was small, but Thor was old enough to catch it. A flicker of something that was not quite anger and not quite surprise, but lived in the neighborhood of both. The smile stayed intact, the eyes recalibrated. "Right," Homelander said. "Well, I'm the most powerful man on the planet, so... Hi, nice to meet you." Now, the friendliness dropped about 3 degrees. "I'm going to need you to come down to street level with me, answer a few questions for some people who are very eager to meet you, and then we'll figure out what to do with you from there. How's that sound?" "It sounds like a demand dressed as a question," Thor said. Homelander laughed. It was a real laugh. Or real enough. "You know what? I like you. I do. Big guy, good voice, clearly not scared of heights." He gestured at Mjolnir with a slight tilt of his chin. "Cool hammer. Where'd you get it?" "I did not get it," Thor said. "It came to me." Right. Homelander nodded slowly, and the nodding slowed and stopped, and the smile finished dying. "Here's the thing. I'm going to stop asking nicely now. You're unregistered. You're unaffiliated. You showed up out of nowhere with a power signature that's giving my people headaches, and you're floating over my city at 3 in the morning having a philosophical moment. And I have been very patient with you." He straightened in the air, shoulders rolling back, the body language of a man removing a mask he'd grown tired of wearing. "Come down. Now." Thor looked at him for a long moment. The wind moved between them, cold and sharp at this altitude. Below, the cloud deck shifted and eddied, the orange glow of the city bleeding up through the gaps. Thor was tired. He was disoriented in a way he would not admit to a stranger. He had been trying for the better part of 20 minutes to reach Heimdall through a silence that felt less like distance and more like a wall. And he was beginning to understand that whatever had gone wrong with the Bifrost was not a simple misalignment. He was, for the first time in a very long time, genuinely stuck. And he was standing at altitude in a wrong universe, having his patience tested by a man whose face said one thing and whose eyes said something else entirely. He was not in the mood. "I will come down," Thor said, "when I have finished what I am attempting to do. You are welcome to wait." He turned away. He heard the heat vision before he felt it, a sharp ionizing crack in the air, and he moved on instinct, rotating his body and raising Mjolnir, and the twin laser beams struck the flat of the hammer's head with a sound like a gunshot amplified through a concert hall. The impact rang up Thor's arm from wrist to shoulder, and he felt it, genuinely felt it, which told him something useful about this man's strength. The beams deflected upward and cut twin burning lines through the cloud ceiling before dying out. Thor looked at his hammer, looked at Homelander. Homelander looked genuinely surprised, not frightened, not yet, but surprised in the way a man is surprised when the nail doesn't go in on the first swing. "You," Thor said, and his voice had changed, all the patience and careful neutrality gone out of it, something older and considerably less forgiving in its place. "Should not have done that." He did not attack. He was not angry enough yet for that, and he was not the man he had been in younger and worse years, when anger was his first language. But he raised Mjolnir and he spun it once, a slow rotation that built into something faster, and the clouds above them began to compress and rotate in a wide spiral, and the first crack of thunder arrived not from the distance but from directly overhead, to a concussive snap that pressed down on everything within half a mile. Lightning split the air between them. Not aimed, not a weapon, just the atmosphere responding to what was in his hand. And the gap between two men who had been talking closed into the gap between two men who were not talking anymore. Homelander came at him. The first collision happened at roughly 1,200 feet above Lower Manhattan, and the shock wave from it blew the top layer of cloud outward in a perfect expanding ring that 3 weather satellites and 1 very confused National Weather Service operator would spend the following week trying to explain. Thor caught the charge across his left pauldron, spun with it rather than against it, brought Mjolnir around in a horizontal arc, and struck Homelander across the chest. The sound it made was extraordinary. A cathedral bell dropped from the top of its tower onto stone. Homelander went sideways through the cloud ceiling and was gone for 2 full seconds before he came back up through it fast, cape shredded at the edge, suit scorched where the hammer had landed, and his face had changed completely. The smile was ash. What was underneath it was raw and bright and very dangerous. "Okay," Homelander said, blood at the corner of his lip. "Okay." Thor set his feet in the air the way only certain kinds of being have ever learned to do. Weight distributed, Mjolnir loose in his grip, and waited to see what came next. The fight lasted 4 minutes before Thor ended it. not ended it in the permanent sense. He was not trying to kill this man, whoever he was, whatever he was, but ended it in the sense that after 4 minutes of trading impacts at altitude above lower Manhattan, Thor caught Homelander by the throat mid-charge, reversed his momentum with one brutal rotation, and drove him straight down through both cloud layers and into the roof of a parking structure on Fulton Street with enough force to compress the top 2 floors into the third. The building didn't collapse. It groaned, deep and structural, dust and debris fountaining outward in a gray cloud, car alarms triggering in every vehicle on the surrounding block. And Homelander lay in the crater he had made of the concrete roof and stared up at the open sky with an expression nobody at Vought had ever been permitted to see on camera. Thor landed 12 feet away, cape settling around him, and looked down at him. "Are you finished?" he said. It was not quite a question. Homelander turned his head and looked at him from the rubble. There was blood on his face now, a real split above his left eyebrow, and the sight of it seemed to be doing something complicated to his internal architecture. He was the kind of man. Thor recognized the type, had known warriors like this across 9 realms, whose entire identity was built on a foundation of being the strongest thing in any given room. And the foundation had just cracked in a way it had never cracked before, and he did not yet know what to do with that information. "I'm going to kill you," Homelander said quietly, almost conversationally. "Perhaps," Thor said, "but not tonight." He turned away. "I have other concerns." He rose back into the air, angling south toward the waterfront, because he needed open sky and distance from the city's electromagnetic interference to make another attempt at Heimdall. Behind him, he could hear Homelander pulling himself free from the concrete, could hear the specific controlled breathing of a man swallowing something he intended to deal with later. Thor filed it away and kept moving. What happened next was the part he had not prepared for. He dropped down toward street level near the waterfront, looking for a quiet space, and found instead that the street was not quiet at all. 3 news vans had already positioned themselves along the river road, cameras up, the footage from Destiny Okafor's video having mobilized every overnight crew in the borough. Bright lights hit him the moment he descended below rooftop level, and a woman with a microphone was running toward him before his boots touched the ground. And behind her, 2 NYPD units were pulling up fast, and somewhere above him, a police helicopter was dropping altitude with a searchlight already burning. Thor stopped, looked at the cameras, looked at the officers exiting their vehicles with weapons drawn, looked at the woman with the microphone who had stopped 6 feet away and was staring at him with an expression of absolute professional determination that he recognized as a variant of courage, even if the context was baffling. Can you tell us your name?" she said, microphone extended. Her hand was shaking. Her voice wasn't. "My name is Thor," he said. She blinked. Behind her, he could hear her cameraman say something under his breath. "And where are you from?" He considered the question honestly. "Far from here," he said. "Are you affiliated with Vought International?" He did not know what Vought International was. He said so. The reporter absorbed this and pivoted without breaking stride. "There are reports of a confrontation in the air above lower Manhattan. Were you involved in an altercation with Homelander?" "The man in the blue suit," Thor said. "Yes. He fired upon me without provocation. I defended myself." He paused. "Is he known to you?" The reporter stared at him. The camera light was very bright and very hot. Behind her, two officers were edging closer with weapons still raised, conducting the specific tactical shuffle of people who understood their weapons were probably useless, but had no alternative protocol to follow. Thor turned to them and held up one hand. Not a threat, a gesture of acknowledgement. I see you, I am not ignoring you. And then turned back to the reporter. I need to speak with whoever governs this city, he said. Your mayor, your highest authority. I have no hostile intentions toward this place or its people. I am attempting to return home and I require assistance that your authorities may or may not be able to provide. He looked directly into the camera, understanding instinctively that the camera was the real audience. I ask only for information and for patience while I resolve my situation. It was, by any measure, as an entirely reasonable statement. What happened because of it was not reasonable at all. The footage of him saying it, calm, direct, enormous, Mjolnir in hand, one parking structure visibly demolished in the background, was on every screen in America within 20 minutes. And in a world where every powered individual was a corporate asset and every public statement by a superhuman was a carefully managed PR product, a genuinely unscripted, unaffiliated, unmanaged, superpowered being speaking directly to camera about wanting to talk to the mayor was not reassuring. It was terrifying, because it meant nobody owned him. Nobody had his contract, nobody had the bomb in his neck, or the leverage on his family, or the compromat in the filing cabinet that kept everyone else in line. Ashley Barrett watched it from the Vault Tower Situation Room with her head in her hands. The mayor's office called vote before they called the NYPD. The NYPD called vote before they called the governor. The governor called vote before he called anyone in Washington. This was the order of things in this world, and everyone understood it, and it made Thor's request, speak to your highest authority, quietly, completely impossible. Because the highest authority was a corporation, and corporations did not have press conferences with uncontracted superpowered strangers at 4 a.m. What they had instead was Queen Maeve. She came in low from the north, dropping out of the sky with considerably less spectacle than Homelander ever managed. Landing on the river road 30 feet from Thor with a sound like a large stone settling. She straightened up, looked at him with the gray eyes of a woman who had been doing this for too long and retained no illusions about it, and held both hands slightly away from her body in a gesture that communicated, with economical precision, that she was not here to fight. "I'm Maeve," she said. "Thor," he said. "I know, it was on camera." She looked at him steadily. "You hit Homelander. He fired on me first." "I know that too." She glanced at the news cameras still rolling 20 feet away and made a small decision behind her eyes. "Can we move this conversation off camera? Somewhere the whole country isn't watching in real time?" "I'm not hiding," Thor said. "So I have done nothing that requires concealment." Maeve looked at him for a long moment. Something in her posture shifted, barely perceptible. A fraction of tension releasing from her shoulders, like a door opening a crack. "No," she said quietly. "You really haven't, have you?" She looked at the camera crews, at the police units, at the helicopter still circling, and then she looked back at him. "They're going to send everyone at you. You understand that? Homelander will not let this go. Vought will not let this go. Whatever you need to do to get home, you're going to need space and time to do it. And this city is not going to give you either." Thor met her eyes. There was something genuine in them, buried under years of something else, but genuine nonetheless. He respected it. "Why are you telling me this?" She was quiet for a moment. "Because you asked to speak to someone honest," she said, "and everyone else you're going to meet tonight is going to lie to your face." She held his gaze. "I'm trying to be the exception." Above them, the helicopter banked, searchlight sweeping. On the far side of the river road, a Vault tactical vehicle turned the corner, and then another behind it, and the night was getting complicated in all the ways she had warned him it would. Billy Butcher found him by following the helicopters. It was not a sophisticated method, but it was reliable, and Butcher had always preferred reliable over sophisticated. He came in Frenchie's van, the four of them packed into it. Frenchie driving, Mother's Milk in the passenger seat working his phone, Huey in the back with his knees up against a crate of equipment looking like a man who had been woken at 3 in the morning and had not yet reconciled himself to the situation. Butcher sat beside Huey and said nothing the whole way downtown, which everyone in the van understood to mean he was thinking, and when Butcher was thinking, you did not interrupt him unless the building was on fire, and sometimes not even then. So they parked on a side street off the river road, and Butcher got out and walked to the corner and stood there with his hands in his jacket pockets and looked at the scene for a long moment. The news vans, the police cordon that had expanded to cover 2 full blocks, the Vault tactical units positioned at both ends of the road, the helicopter, and in the middle of all of it, standing near the waterfront railing with Queen Maeve a careful distance away, the man, the impossible, bloody man. Butcher looked at him for a long time. Mother's Milk appeared at his shoulder. "You seeing what I'm seeing?" "Depends what you're seeing," Butcher said. "I'm seeing something that put Homelander through a parking structure roof and is still standing there looking bored about it." "Then yes," Butcher said. That's what I'm seeing." Frenchie joined them, hands wrapped around a paper cup of terrible petrol station coffee, eyes bright with the particular enthusiasm he reserved for things that were either brilliant or catastrophic, often simultaneously. "The energy signature from that hammer," he said without preamble, "is not Compound 5. It is not any known enhancement. Our equipment cannot categorize it. I have been running comparisons for 40 minutes, and the closest analog I can find is..." He paused for effect. "Nothing. There is no closest analog." "He's not a supe," Huey said, appearing behind Frenchie, zipping his jacket against the river wind. "Like not at all, not even a little bit." "No," Butcher agreed. "Then what is he?" Butcher didn't answer. He was watching the way the man stood. The weight distribution, the stillness, so the way he held the hammer, not like a weapon on standby, but like a thing that simply belonged in his hand, the way a hand belongs at the end of an arm. He was watching the way the man had turned toward the Vault tactical units when they arrived, assessed them in under 2 seconds, and then turned away again in the way you turn away from things that do not constitute a threat. He was watching the way Maeve was standing near him, and Maeve, in Butcher's long experience, did not stand near things that scared her without putting considerable distance between herself and the thing first. Maeve was not scared of this man. Maeve was something more interesting than scared. "Right," Butcher said. He straightened up, rolled his neck, and started walking toward the cordon. "Billy," Mother's Milk said, though in the tone of a man who has learned that this particular tone accomplishes nothing but still deploys it out of loyalty to reason. We cannot walk up to whatever that is. "Watch me," Butcher said, already walking. Getting through the police cordon required his credentials. One phone call he made while standing directly in front of the officer running the line, and the specific brand of cheerful, implacable pressure that Butcher applied to bureaucratic obstacles the way a river applies itself to rock. He was through in 4 minutes. The others followed in his wake. The officer watched them go with the expression of a man who knew he'd been managed and couldn't identify the exact moment it had happened. Butcher stopped 15 feet from Thor. Thor looked at him, and the look was direct and unhurried and assessed him completely in about 1 second, which Butcher recognized because he did the same thing to everyone he met. "You're not police," Thor said, "and you're not with the ones in the vehicles." "No," Butcher said. "And I'm not with her either," he added, nodding at Maeve. Maeve looked at him with the resigned expression of someone arriving at a party to find someone they'd hoped to avoid. "Name's Butcher. Billy Butcher, and I'm probably the only person you're going to talk to tonight who doesn't want something from you." "Everyone wants something," Thor said. "Fair point. Let me rephrase." Butcher put his hands back in his pockets. "I don't want to own you, control you, study you, sign you, or point you at something for my own benefit." He paused. "I want to know what you are, because in my experience, anything that frightens Vought International this much at 4 in the bloody morning is worth understanding." Thor studied him for a moment. "You know these people. Vought. Know them, hate them, spend most of my waking life trying to burn them to the ground," Butcher said pleasantly. "It's a whole thing." Behind Butcher, Huey gave a small, uncomfortable wave. Frenchie raised his coffee. Mother's Milk looked like he was already composing his letter of resignation. Thor looked at them. Something shifted very slightly in his expression. Not warmth exactly, but a kind of recognition. These were not soldiers following orders. These were not corporate operatives running a protocol. These were people who had chosen their particular war themselves and were living inside it. And whatever else they were, that was something he understood. "I am trying to open a path home," Thor said. "It requires significant energy. And space." "How much space?" Butcher said. Thor considered. "More than this street." Butcher nodded slowly, looked at the Vought vehicles, looked back at Thor. "Well," he said, "that's going to be a problem." They moved to the Brooklyn waterfront because Maeve suggested it and nobody had a better idea. It was Maeve's logic, delivered quietly while the Vought tactical team was still establishing its perimeter and the chain of command was still sorting itself out through 3 layers of corporate bureaucracy. The industrial waterfront on the Brooklyn side was largely derelict at this hour. The nearest residential buildings were far enough back that collateral risk was manageable, and more importantly, it was outside the immediate jurisdiction of the cordon that was rapidly tightening around the Manhattan side. She said all of this in a flat, practical tone that suggested she was not doing Thor any favors, merely solving a logistical problem. Thor listened and nodded and rose into the air without ceremony. Maeve followed. A Butcher took the van across the bridge and arrived 3 minutes later to find Thor already standing on a concrete dock extending over the black water of the East River. Cape moving in the pre-dawn wind off the harbor, looking up at the sky with an expression of concentrated effort that Butcher recognized as the look of a man attempting something that wasn't working. The Brooklyn waterfront at 4:30 in the morning was not silent. The water moved, slapping against the dock pilings in a low rhythmic percussion. Somewhere upriver, a tugboat pushed through the dark. Across the water, the Manhattan skyline stood sharp and cold, and if you looked at the right building on Fulton Street, you could still see the compressed top floors of the parking structure, a notch in the roofline that hadn't been there an hour ago. Thor planted his feet on the dock, spread his stance, and raised Mjolnir with both hands above his head. What happened next was something that none of them, not Maeve, not Butcher, not Frenchie, who had seen extraordinary things, not Mother's Milk, who prided himself on staying level, were remotely prepared for. The sky opened, not metaphorically. The cloud deck above the waterfront began to rotate, slowly at first, then with gathering momentum, a vast, slow spiral that compressed and darkened at its center, as the energy flowing up from Mjolnir drove into it like a column. Lightning came. Not the ordinary forked atmospheric kind, but something structural, geometric, branching in patterns too regular to be random, reaching from the rotating clouds down toward the hammer in sustained crackling arcs that lit the entire waterfront in stuttering white light. The East River surface went flat and then began to vibrate, small concentric rings expanding from directly below Thor's position as the resonance moved through the ground and into the water. The tugboat upriver killed its engine. The news helicopter that had followed them across the bridge dropped 200 feet in about 1 second as the air pressure in its vicinity changed dramatically, the pilot fighting to hold altitude and losing the argument. Mjolnir was screaming. There was no other word for it. A high sustained harmonic that was not quite sound and not quite something else, and a frequency that sat between the teeth and behind the eyes and made Huey press both hands over his ears and Frenchie's coffee lid vibrate off his cup. The sky above the spiral was clearing, the clouds driven outward, a perfect circle of open black sky appearing above the waterfront, with stars visible through it, clean and cold. And then Thor stopped. He lowered Mjolnir. The rotation slowed. The lightning died. The harmonic faded, leaving a ringing absence in its place. The clouds drifted back. The river surface normalized. The helicopter regained its altitude, and somewhere inside it a pilot took the first full breath he had managed in 90 seconds. Thor stood on the dock with Mjolnir at his side and looked up at the ordinary, unhelpful sky. The silence lasted a long time. "It is not there," he said. His voice was level, carefully level, in the way of a man who is placing each word down deliberately because the alternative is something he is not willing to display in front of strangers. "The path. There is no residual trace. The fracture has sealed entirely." He paused. "I cannot force an opening from this side. The energy required would be..." Another pause. "Beyond what I'm willing to release in proximity to a populated area." Nobody said anything for a moment. "So you're stuck," Butcher said. "For now," Thor said. "How long is for now?" "I don't know." He said it simply, without performance, just the flat, honest weight of it. "I've never been stranded in this manner. The Bifrost has always been accessible. What occurred during my transit? The fracture. I do not fully understand it. And something in the mechanics of this universe resists the connection." He turned Mjolnir slowly in his hand, studying it. "The hammer can feel it. There is something different here, in the fabric of this place. Frenchie was staring at him with the focused intensity of a man running rapid calculations. "When you attempted to open the path just now," he said carefully, "the energy output was..." The waterfront lit up like a nuclear test. Our equipment registered a reading that shouldn't be physically possible. And that was you failing. "Yes," Thor said. Frenchie looked at Mother's Milk. Mother's Milk looked at the river. Maeve had been standing back from all of it, arms folded, watching Thor with the same expression she'd worn on the river road. That fractional openness, that door ajar. She walked forward now, boots on the wet concrete. Damon stopped beside him and looked out at the Manhattan skyline. "Vought has that entire block locked down," she said. "They'll have this location in under 10 minutes. When they come, they won't come with conversation." She looked sideways at him. "Homelander will be with them, and he won't be alone this time." Thor looked at the skyline, at the notch in the Fulton Street roofline. "How many?" he said. "All of them," she said. "The 7. Whatever else Ashley can mobilize." She held his gaze. "I've never seen anyone hit Homelander like that. The whole organization is terrified right now, and terrified people in this world don't negotiate. They assemble." Thor nodded slowly, set his jaw, looked at Butcher. Butcher was already smiling, which was the most unsettling thing anyone on that dock had seen all night. And the bar was extraordinarily high. "Right then," Butcher said. "Let's talk about what happens when they get here. They came across the river at 5:11 in the morning, and they came all at once. Homelander led from the front because Homelander always led from the front, because the alternative was admitting that the front was somewhere he might not want to be. He came in fast and high, a white and blue streak dropping out of the pre-dawn sky over the Manhattan Bridge, and behind him came the rest of the 7 in a loose formation that looked almost military from a distance and fell apart under any serious scrutiny. The Deep flew badly and knew it, maintaining altitude through visible effort. Black Noir came in low along the waterfront, using the derelict buildings for cover in the practiced way of someone who understood tactical approach. Starlight rose off the Manhattan side, glowing white at her hands, jaw set, moving forward because she had been ordered to, and because the alternative was a conversation with Homelander she wasn't ready to have. A-Train was somewhere in the perimeter, too fast to track, burning velocity on the approach roads. And Queen Maeve, who had been standing on the Brooklyn dock for the past 30 minutes, looked up at the formation coming across the water and made a quiet decision and stepped backward out of Thor's immediate vicinity, not fleeing, not joining, simply removing herself from the geometry of what was about to happen. Thor watched them come. He had sent Butcher and the others back. Not a request, a statement delivered with the particular authority of someone who has given orders in genuine battles and knows the difference between useful allies and people who will be killed by proximity. Butcher had objected, briefly, in the way Butcher objected to everything, with profanity and lateral argument. And then Mother's Milk had put a hand on his arm and said "Billy" in a tone that meant, "This is not our fight." And Butcher had looked at Thor for a long moment, and then taken his people back to the van. They were parked 2 blocks inland, close enough to watch, far enough to survive. The hammer was in Thor's hand. The sky above the waterfront was doing what it did when he was paying attention to it, thickening slightly, the clouds developing the compressed, pressurized quality of air that knows what is coming and is preparing itself. Homelander landed 20 feet away on the dock and looked at him and said nothing for a moment. The split above his eyebrow from the parking structure had closed, the skin sealed, to no trace remaining. He looked rested. He looked calm. He looked like a man who had spent the intervening hour talking himself back into certainty, and the certainty was visible in the set of his shoulders and the quality of his stillness, and it was the brittle, performed kind, not the real kind, and Thor could tell the difference. "I brought friends," Homelander said. "I see them," Thor said. The Deep landed heavily to Homelander's left, stumbled slightly on the wet concrete, and stood up straight with the expression of a man hoping nobody had noticed. Black Noir materialized from the shadow of a warehouse doorway to the right, silent, already within striking distance, which Thor noted and filed. Starlight came down 30 feet back, light still at her hands, and her eyes went to Thor, and stayed there with an expression he read clearly. She did not want to be here. A train blurred into existence at the far end of the dock, and stood with his hands on his knees, catching his breath, looking at Thor with something between professional assessment and naked unease. 5 of them, plus Maeve standing apart, plus whatever was positioned beyond his eye line. Thor had faced worse numbers. He had faced worse than this before breakfast, in darker centuries, in wars that made whatever this corporation was running look like a neighborhood dispute. He stood on the dock and felt the old machinery of himself engage. Not anger, not yet, but readiness. The deep structural readiness of something that has been built for exactly this and knows it. "Here is what's going to happen," Homelander said, stepping forward. "You're going to put the hammer down, you're going to come with us, and you're going to answer every question our people have for you, and in exchange, nobody gets hurt." He spread his hands. A reasonable man. A generous man. "That's the deal. I declined a similar offer earlier," Thor said. "My position has not changed." Homelander nodded as if he'd expected this, as if he'd prepared for it, and said, "Get him." And the 7 moved. Black Noir came first, because Black Noir always came first when there was something to be evaluated. A quick, precise strike to the throat that would have killed a human being, and did nothing to Thor except redirect his attention. Thor caught the follow-up strike by the wrist, pivoted, and threw Black Noir the length of the dock. He hit the warehouse wall at the far end, and the wall lost the argument. The Deep came in from the left, swinging, and Thor moved aside and let the momentum carry him past, and put a hand between his shoulder blades and pressed him firmly into the concrete of the dock, face down, and left him there. 2 seconds. 2 of them neutralized. Then Homelander hit him from above with everything he had. It was, Thor would acknowledge privately, a serious hit. The impact drove him through the dock and into the water beneath it, the pilings exploding outward, the whole structure collapsing into the East River in a cascade of timber and concrete. He hit the riverbed, felt it, rolled, and was back out of the water and in the air before the debris had finished falling, soaked, cape plastered against him, Mjolnir still in his fist. Homelander was waiting at altitude. His eyes were glowing red. Not warming up. Already at full burn, twin beams lancing down toward Thor the moment he cleared the waterline. Thor took them across the chest, the impact pushing him backward through the air, his boots cutting furrows in the river surface, and felt the heat of them, genuine, scorching heat, enough to blister armor that did not blister easily. He stopped his backward slide, planted himself in the air, the laser eyes intensified. Thor raised Mjolnir and the sky cracked, and a lightning bolt the width of a car came down and struck Homelander dead center, and the laser eyes went out. Homelander fell 40 feet before he arrested his descent. Smoke rising from his suit, hair standing in every direction, hovering unsteadily, looking at Thor with an expression that had finally, completely, abandoned all pretense of control. Starlight hit Thor from behind. A full discharge, white electromagnetic light, everything she had. And he felt it, a crackling, overwhelming pressure across his back and shoulders that actually staggered him forward in the air, which surprised him. He turned and looked at her, and she was shaking with the effort of it, both hands extended, teeth gritted, pushing past any limit she'd ever pushed to before. He could see it costing her. He could see that she knew it wasn't enough, and she was doing it anyway. He did not hit her. He deflected the discharge with the flat of Mjolnir, redirected it skyward, and looked at her steadily until she stopped. "You are brave," he said, "and you are fighting for the wrong people." She stared at him. Something in her face broke open just slightly, just for a moment, before she closed it again. A train hit him then at full speed, a running tackle that connected with his left side, and Thor went sideways through the air, and A-Train's leg made a sound on impact that indicated it had not come out of the exchange well. He went down in a spinning fall toward the waterfront, and Thor steadied himself and looked down at the scene below. The collapsed dock, the debris-strewn water, Noir climbing out of a wall, the deep, still face down on a section of concrete that hadn't yet gone into the river, and then looked at Homelander, who was coming back up with his eyes already burning red again. The sky above the waterfront was very dark now, very close. The clouds had built while they fought, not naturally, not meteorologically, but because Thor was in them, part of them, and his mood was deteriorating. He had been patient. He had been remarkably, extraordinarily patient. The civilian was a woman in her 50s named Carol Reyes. She had no business being on the Brooklyn waterfront at 5 in the morning, and she would later explain to every journalist who asked that she had been walking her dog, a small ancient beagle named Maurice, along the industrial road when the noise started, and that she had not run because Maurice refused to run on account of his arthritis, and that she had ducked behind a concrete barrier at the water's edge and stayed there because there was nowhere else to go. She was crouched behind that barrier with Maurice pressed against her shins when the dock collapsed into the river and the shock wave from the impact rolled through the concrete beneath her and knocked the barrier sideways, and she went with it, sliding toward the water's edge, her fingers finding nothing to grip on the wet ground. Maurice barking in short, panicked bursts, the black river 12 inches from her outstretched hand. Thor saw her before anyone else did. He was at altitude, 30 feet up, Mjolnir raised, already beginning the rotation that pulled weather systems the way a drain pulls water. The clouds above him churning with accumulated charge. Homelander 15 feet away, with his eyes burning, and 4 members of the 7 repositioning below. He saw the woman and the dog and the barrier and the river's edge in one peripheral instant, and made the calculation in less time than it takes to describe it. He dropped. He crossed 30 feet of air in a fraction of a second, landed between the woman and the water's edge. I got one arm around her and one hand under the concrete barrier and pushed it back upright, and then he was crouched in front of her on the wet ground with Mjolnir in the dirt beside him, and his hand extended, palm up, and he said, "Take my hand, move back from the edge, quickly." She stared at him. Enormous man, soaking wet, armor scorched in 3 places, kneeling in front of her on an industrial waterfront at 5 in the morning, offering his hand with the same expression you might expect from someone helping you pick up dropped groceries. Maurice sniffed his gauntlet. She took his hand. He got her upright and moved her back 20 feet from the water's edge in about 4 seconds and set her behind the structural wall of a warehouse that was still standing. "Stay here," he said. "Do not move until the sky is clear." She nodded, mute, but he looked at the dog. "Both of you," he said. He turned back toward the waterfront. What he saw when he turned around was Homelander, hovering at medium altitude with his phone extended in one hand and his eyes burning soft red. And it took Thor a moment to understand that the man was filming him, filming the interaction with the woman, hovering above a battlefield of his own creation, surrounded by the wreckage of a dock and a collapsed warehouse wall and 4 injured members of his own team, and filming. "That," Homelander said, loud enough to carry, loud enough for the news helicopter that had crept back into range to pick up on its audio feed, "is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." His voice was warm and rich and completely manufactured. "Ladies and gentlemen," our mystery man stops in the middle of a fight to save a civilian. What a hero. He lowered the phone and looked at Thor with a smile that made the 4 in the morning smile look genuine by comparison. "You know what that footage is worth? In terms of the narrative?" He tilted his head. "We could work with you, big guy. Seriously. Whatever contract you want. You've got the look, you've got the power, you've clearly got the instincts." The smile widened. "Think about it. Your face on a billboard, Vought backing, the whole machine behind you." He spread his arms wide, a man offering everything. "You'd never have to worry about getting home again." Thor looked at him for a very long time. The wind off the river was cold. Behind him he could hear Maurice's quiet, distressed panting. Around the waterfront, news cameras that had crept forward during the brief lull were running, all of it live. The sun beginning its first gray suggestion on the eastern horizon. The sky above the waterfront still dark and heavy with what Thor had been building in it. "You turned a battlefield," Thor said, "into an advertisement." "Everything's an advertisement," Homelander said pleasantly. "That's the world." "Not every world," Thor said. Something went out of his voice when he said it. Not volume, he wasn't louder. Something else. Some quality of restraint, some careful calibration he had been maintaining since the alley on VC Street, since the rooftop conversation, since the police cruisers and the cameras and the corporate vehicles and the endless, relentless machinery of this place that turned everything. Fear, violence, heroism, and a woman nearly drowning, a dog's panic, into content. He had been patient because patience was what the situation called for. He had been measured because he was not here to destroy this place, had never been here to destroy it, wanted nothing from it except a way home. But there was a line between patience and complicity, and Homelander had just walked up to it and tap-danced on it in front of 10 million live viewers. Thor looked up at the sky he had been building. Then he looked back at Homelander, and Homelander, for the first time since this had all begun, looked at what was in Thor's eyes and stopped smiling. "I'm going to ask you one more time," Thor said quietly. "All of you, stand down. Let me work. Let me go home, and I will leave this place exactly as I found it." Nobody moved. The clouds above the waterfront pulsed once, like a held breath. "So be it," Thor said. He stopped holding back. It was not a dramatic gesture. There was no war cry, no speech, no moment of visible transformation that the cameras could capture cleanly and replay in slow motion. What happened was quieter and more absolute than that. Thor simply stopped managing the thing inside him that he had been managing since the moment he arrived in this wrong universe. The careful, measured throttle that separated a god operating among mortals from a god operating as himself. And the sky responded to the change the way water responds to a stone dropped into it. Immediately, completely, without negotiation. The clouds above the Brooklyn waterfront stopped rotating and started descending. Not drifting, descending with intent, and dropping toward the river in a solid, dark mass that turned the pre-dawn gray into something closer to midnight. The air pressure underneath changing so dramatically that every loose object on the waterfront, debris, timber from the collapsed dock, a news van's side mirror, empty pallets stacked against a warehouse wall, lifted several inches off the ground simultaneously, held there for a moment, and then scattered outward as the first real wind arrived. Not a gust. A sustained directional force that hit the waterfront like a physical wall, driving the news helicopters back a quarter mile in under 10 seconds, toppling 2 Vought tactical vehicles onto their sides on the access road, and stripping the remaining glass from every window in the derelict warehouse behind Thor's position. Homelander felt it and didn't move. He was not going to be the one who moved. The lightning came next, and it was nothing like the lightning from before. The earlier strikes had been warnings, had been precise, had been the lightning of a man making a point. This was different. This was lightning that came from everywhere at once, branching down from the descending cloud mass in a continuous shifting lattice that covered the entire waterfront in flickering white light. Not striking, not yet, just present, filling the air, crackling between the warehouse rooftops, runnings in sheets across the surface of the East River, turning the water into a mirror that reflected a sky on fire. The sound was not thunder. Thunder was a consequence, an aftermath. This was the sound of the atmosphere itself being restructured to a continuous bass frequency that didn't travel through air so much as through the ground, through the concrete, through the bones of anyone standing within a quarter mile of its source. Butcher felt it in the van 2 blocks back and gripped the dashboard with both hands. "Christ," he said quietly. Frenchie, beside him, said nothing. His coffee had spilled on his lap, and he had not noticed. Homelander came at Thor with everything he had, and Thor caught him. Not deflected. Not redirected. Caught. One hand around Homelander's forearm as he came in at full charge, the grip locking, and Thor pivoted and swung him in a full arc and released him into the East River at a trajectory and velocity that sent him under the surface and across the riverbed and up through the Manhattan riverbank on the other side, erupting from the ground in a fountain of earth and asphalt on the FDR Drive, cars swerving, a manhole cover launching 30 feet into the air. The whole city felt it. Seismographs at Columbia University would later record it as a 2.3. Black noir came from behind, blades out, and Thor spun and the hammer came around, and the impact sent Noir through the air in a flat spin that cleared 200 feet before he hit a crane structure at the far end of the waterfront. The crane folded. Noir hung from the wreckage, still not dead, but definitively finished for the evening. A-Train, already on one damaged leg, made the calculation that self-preservation was wisdom and was gone from the waterfront before the crane finished falling. Thor noted his departure and did not pursue him, and there was no purpose in pursuing someone who had chosen to stop fighting. The Deep looked at the river, looked at where Homelander had gone through the bank, looked at Thor, got back in the water and swam away from the situation with quiet efficiency. Thor watched him go with something that might, in a very different context, have been called respect. Starlight was still there. She was on the ground at the water's edge, one knee down, both hands pressed to the concrete, the discharge she'd expended in the earlier exchange having cost her more than she'd had to spend. She was looking up at Thor with eyes that were clear and direct, and completely without the corporate glaze he'd seen on every other face since arriving in this universe. She was not frightened of him. Or rather, she was frightened of him, and it was not affecting her posture. He walked to her and extended his hand, the same way he'd extended it to Carol Reyes. She looked at it, looked at his face, took it. He got her upright, and she steadied herself and let go of his hand and straightened her jacket. "Thank you," she said, like the words surprised her. "You fought honestly," he said, "and you fight for people who do not deserve it." She opened her mouth, closed it, looked at the river where Homelander had gone through the bank. "I know," she said quietly. Homelander came back. Of course he came back. He came back up out of the river on the Manhattan side, launched himself across the water, soaking and burning-eyed, and past any performance of control now. And the sound coming from him was not a battle cry, so it was something raw and more honest than that, something that had nothing to do with strategy or image or Vort's quarterly projections. It was the sound of a man who had never lost and could not process what was happening to him, could not locate the category for it, and had defaulted to the only response his psychology had ever required of him. Thor rose to meet him above the river. They collided at 60 feet above the water's surface, and the shock wave flattened the East River beneath them in a perfect circle, exposing the riverbed for a full 2 seconds before the water rushed back in. Thor took the hit, rolled with it, came back around, and drove Mjolnir downward onto Homelander's back with both hands, and the full weight of everything above him. The storm, the lightning, the compressed atmosphere, and the energy of a being who had been holding back since 2 a.m. and was no longer holding anything. Homelander went into the river. He did not immediately come back up. The lightning above the waterfront peaked, a single sustained discharge that lasted 11 seconds and covered an area from the Brooklyn Navy Yard to Governor's Island, visible from New Jersey, from Long Island, from aircraft at 30,000 feet that would later describe it to their passengers as the most extraordinary weather event they had ever witnessed. 11 seconds of continuous light, the sky above New York completely white. every camera on every news feed and every personal device in a 3-mile radius, washing out to nothing. When it cleared, Thor was standing on the surface of the river, not hovering, standing, feet on the water, a Mjolnir at his side, the storm above him slowly, gradually, beginning to release its compression. The East River was flat around him, glassy, absolutely still in the aftermath, and the first true light of dawn was arriving from the east, thin and gold and indifferent to everything that had just occurred. Homelander surfaced 30 feet away, found the surface, and held it. He was alive. He was, beneath everything, still extraordinary, built to survive things that would end anything else. But he was holding the surface of the river like a man holds a railing on a ship in bad weather, and he was looking at Thor with an expression that had no name in any PR playbook Vought had ever written. It was not hatred. Hatred was comfortable. Hatred meant you understood the thing opposing you. This was something else. On the Brooklyn bank, Maeve stood and watched and said nothing. In the van 2 blocks back, Butcher sat in silence with his hand still on the dashboard. Frenchie had his window down. Mother's Milk had his eyes closed. Huey was looking at the dawn over the river with his mouth slightly open and an expression of total, uncomprehending awe. On every screen in America, the white flash had cleared, and the image that replaced it, Thor standing on the river at dawn, storm breaking above him, the city behind him enormous and humbled, played on a 7-second loop that no producer had cut to, that no director had framed, that no Vought communications team had approved or anticipated. It played because it was the only thing any camera could find to point at. It would play for days. The dawn came up gold and indifferent over a city that did not know what to do with what it had just seen. The feeds were still running. Every major network, every streaming platform, every phone screen in a 3-mile radius that had survived the electromagnetic discharge was carrying the same image. Thor standing on the surface of the East River as the storm broke above him, the city behind him, the water around him mirror still. And the anchors and commentators and expert panels that filled the airtime around it were all saying variations of the same thing, which was nothing, dressed in professional language and delivered with the careful cadence of people who understood that whatever had just happened existed outside every framework they had been trained to use. The Vaught's communications department had been generating press releases for 2 hours. None of them had been sent. Ashley Barrett sat in the Situation Room on the 44th floor of Vought Tower and looked at the river image on her screen and understood, with the bone-deep clarity of someone who had spent years managing the unmanageable, that there was no press release for this. There was no narrative capture. There was no retroactive branding exercise that put Vaught's logo anywhere near what had just happened on that waterfront, without making the company look like a child drawing a mustache on a photograph of a hurricane. She closed her laptop and made coffee and waited. Thor waded to the Brooklyn bank and stepped out of the river and stood on the concrete and looked at the sky. The storm was releasing slowly, the compressed cloud mass unwinding, the charge in the atmosphere bleeding away through the normal channels. He could feel it going. He could feel, beneath the releasing energy, something else. Something faint and specific, a harmonic in the air that had not been there an hour ago. He stood very still and focused everything he had on it. Maeve approached from the left. She stopped 10 feet away, looked at his face, and did not speak. She had enough experience with significant moments to understand when a person needed silence. The harmonic grew. Faint, extraordinarily faint, like a voice heard through several walls, through the wrong end of a corridor. But there, genuinely there, a frequency he knew better than his own heartbeat. The resonant signature of the Bifrost, searching for a connection point, searching for him. Heimdall, somewhere on the other side of an impossible distance, pushing through the barrier of a universe that should not be accessible, finding the crack that the storm had opened in the fabric of local space and pressing against it with everything available to him. Thor raised Mjolnir, not to fight, to call. He poured everything remaining into it, not the violent, focused energy of combat, but something different, something older, the specific frequency of a man calling home across a distance that had no name in any mortal measurement system. The hammer sang. Not the battle harmonic, not the weather pull. Something purer than either, a single sustained note that rose above the waterfront, and above the city, and above the retreating storm, and found the crack in the sky, and drove into it like a key into a lock. The sky above the waterfront split open. It was nothing like the Bifrost he knew. The Bifrost in its proper function was a bridge of ordered light, geometric, precise. Heimdall's instrument played cleanly. What opened above Brooklyn was a fracture first, jagged, imperfect, the seam between two universes being forced apart by will and hammer song and whatever Heimdall was doing on the other side. And then, gradually, it smoothed, the edges clarifying, the light inside it shifting from wrong to right, from the violet gold of the initial fracture to something cleaner, something that smelled of Asgard even at this distance, even through two layers of reality. Butcher's van pulled up behind the warehouse. The four of them got out and stood in a line and looked at the hole in the sky. Bloody hell, Butcher said, but nobody had anything to add to that. Thor turned. He looked at Maeve first, because she has been the only honest voice in 12 hours of noise, and he owed her acknowledgement. "You could leave," he said. "Whatever holds you here. It does not seem worth the cost." She looked at him for a long moment. "No," she said quietly. "It doesn't." She held his gaze. Maybe that's something I needed to hear from someone who had nothing to gain from saying it. He nodded, turned to Butcher. Butcher had his hands in his pockets and was looking up at the Bifrost fracture with an expression of intense practical assessment, the expression of a man cataloging what he had witnessed for future operational use. He looked down from the sky and met Thor's eyes and said nothing for a moment. "You hit Homelander so hard he went through a riverbank," Butcher said. "Yes," Thor said. "Into the FDR drive. I did not intend the highway specifically." Butcher nodded slowly, jaw moving slightly. Something almost warm moved across his face, quickly contained. "Right," he said. "You go on then." Starlight was there too, standing apart from Butcher's group, arms folded against the morning cold. She looked at Thor with the same clear, direct eyes she'd shown him throughout, the ones that didn't match the uniform or the organization or the carefully constructed public identity. He looked back at her and said nothing because nothing was needed. She understood. He could see that she understood. He turned toward the fracture. Behind him, from the direction of the river, he heard Homelander's approach, the specific air displacement of that man moving at speed. He did not turn around. He heard it slow, stop, hover. The sound of a man who had come to continue something and had arrived to find the moment already gone, the context already dissolved, the opponent already pointed elsewhere. He heard the hovering. He heard the silence of a man who had nothing left to say that would mean anything. He stepped into the fracture. The light took him. The last thing anyone on the Brooklyn waterfront saw was the shape of him against the bifrost glow, enormous, red-caped, hammer at his side. And then the fracture sealed, not explosively, not gradually, but the way a word disappears when you stop saying it. Clean, immediate, gone. The sky above Brooklyn was ordinary again. Dawn light, a few clouds. Sobeya tugboat somewhere upriver resuming its engine. The city returning to itself, or trying to, in the way cities try to return to themselves after something has moved through them that has no category in their experience. On the surface of the East River, the last of the storm's charge dissipated in a shimmer of blue light across the water's surface that lasted 4 seconds and was gone. Homelander hovered above the river alone. He stayed there for a long time. The cameras caught him, still running, still live. The feeds that had carried the entire night's events without interruption. They caught him hovering above the water in the early morning light with the city behind him, and they caught the expression on his face. And the expression was something that the Vault Communications team would spend 6 weeks trying to recontextualize and never fully manage. It was not anger. It was not grief. It was the expression of a man who has understood something he cannot unfeel. That there is something in the universe so far beyond him that it did not even consider him worth destroying. That it stopped a fight to save a woman and her dog. That it called him brave in a tone that meant something genuinely different from what he was used to the word meaning. That it left without claiming anything. Homelander had never been left before. He had always been the one who decided when things ended. He descended slowly to the Brooklyn bank and stood on the concrete where Thor had stood and looked at the ordinary sky and said nothing. And the cameras ran, and the city watched, and for the first time in a very long time, possibly for the first time ever, every person watching the feed had the same thought simultaneously. He looked small. 3 blocks back, Butcher sat on the bonnet of Frenchie's van and drank the last of his cold tea and looked at the sky where the fracture had been. Huey sat beside him. Neither of them spoke for a while. The morning was coming in properly now, the gold of it spreading across the rooftops, the river going from black to dark green to the murky brown it was during the day. So, Huey said eventually, that happened. Yes, it did, Butcher said. What do we do with it? Butcher considered the question honestly, which was not something he did with every question. He looked at the river, at Homelander's distant figure on the bank, yet diminished in the morning light, at the notch in the Fulton Street skyline across the water, at the sky that was just a sky again. We remember it, he said. Every detail, every second. He finished his tea. Because now we know something we didn't know yesterday. He set the mug down on the bonnet. They can be hit, really hit, hard enough that they don't come back up right away. He looked at Huey. We always believed it was possible. Now we've seen it. He slid off the bonnet and straightened his jacket. Changes things. Frenchie appeared around the side of the van. The Deep swam to New Jersey, he reported. Nobody responded to this. They got in the van. Frenchie started the engine. The van pulled away from the waterfront, as the city came fully awake around it, and the morning swallowed it, and it was gone. Thor did not look back when the Bifrost took him. He had learned, across centuries and wars and losses that would have broken lesser beings, that looking back was a luxury reserved for those who had the option of returning. He did not know if he could ever find this universe again. Did not know if the fracture Heimdall had forced open could be replicated, or if it had been a singular event born of extraordinary effort and fortunate timing. He stepped through the light and felt the familiar geometry of the Bifrost reassemble around him and let the wrongness of that other place fall away, like water off armor. But he did not forget it. He would carry it. The rain on Vesey Street, the woman with the microphone whose hand shook but whose voice didn't, Carol Reyes and her arthritic dog, or the honest eyes of a warrior trapped in a corrupt machine, the face of a man who had never been left before standing alone on a concrete bank at dawn. He would carry the understanding that there were worlds where power had been captured, packaged, and sold, where the machinery of heroism had been stripped of everything heroism actually required and replaced with branding, and that in those worlds, the people who still fought honestly did so at enormous personal cost and without adequate recognition, and kept fighting anyway. He found that he respected that more than he could easily articulate. In New York, in the world he had left, the footage ran for days. Analysts and theorists and corporate strategists produced thousands of words about the unknown figure and produced no useful conclusions. VIVOT issued a statement describing the event as an anomalous atmospheric phenomenon and a routine training exercise, and nobody believed either claim, and the statement was quietly deleted. Homelander gave no interviews about it. Not one. Maeve tendered a quiet, internal procedural complaint about the deployment conditions of the waterfront engagement that went nowhere and was filed and was not forgotten by the person who filed it. Starlight said nothing publicly. Privately, she replayed one moment on a loop. A hand extended, palm up, no conditions attached, and sat with what it meant for a long time. Billy Butcher pinned one word to the board above his desk. He did not underline it this time. He didn't need to. He already knew it was true. The multiverse never sleeps. More crossovers await.